Project Moon is a South Korean game studio known for works such as Lobotomy Corporation, Library of Ruina, and Limbus Company. This essay plans to focus on the incorporation of literature into Project Moon's collective universe, dubbed The City, a high-tech sci-fi dystopia effectively being powered by human suffering. I aim to look at novels such as Wuthering Heights, Moby Dick, and others, and how their stories have been adapted into the world of The City, as well as the transition from novel to gameplay experience. How playing a game differs from watching an adaptation made for screen audiences. As Hutchin states, the work and pleasure of the observing audience are different from the kinetic and cognitive involvement of the interactive gamer. There's also the element of the perennial nature that literature holds, the impact that it made on audiences at the time in comparison to what contemporary audiences can derive from the stories now, and with the transition of settings too. Not only being transported into a fictional world existing in an entirely different genre from its original form, but also the interpretation by CEO Kim Ji-hoon and his team of indie developers. As well as the reason that literature continues to be adapted into several forms, mediums such as films, plays, video games, graphic novels, and musicals. The influences from literature stretch far. Don Quixote, written by Miguel Cervantes, is regarded as the first modern novel and a basis for the fictional trope of hero and sidekick, even going so far as to develop the word Quixotic in the English language, meaning having or marked by a tendency to be guided more by ideals than reality. It comments on an intrinsic nature of humanity and contains themes that resonate with contemporary audiences, ideas of questioning reality and an inherent madness that lies within living in the real world. Terry Gilliam's The Man Who Killed Don Quixote follows the framework of the novel of Don Quixote, with the reality of the setting put into question through the perspective of an unreliable narrator, being Toby, as he uses meta-narrative devices to interact with the audience directly, such as his interference with the subtitles.
Brillante. Hey, ¿qué estamos haciendo? We don't need these. We understand one another perfectly.
Putting into question the entire scene that previously unfolded. Throughout the film, Toby becomes increasingly Quixotic, until developing into a Quixote figure himself, with a newfound squire and continuing the impossible dream. The Man Who Killed Don Quixote is not a one-to-one adaptation of the novel itself. It does contain an original story. The film essentially operates as translation with latitude, where the author is kept in view, but his words are not so strictly followed. The same applies for Hellscreen. Originally written by Ryunosuke Akutagawa in 1918, then adapted for screen in 1969, the novel follows Yoshihide, an artist who paints portraits of human suffering, which he can only paint after witnessing them with his own eyes. The novel ends with Yoshihide witnessing his daughter being burned alive by a feudal lord, in an effort to create a picture of hell. There are changes in the way the story is told for screen. First and foremost, the shift from a single-track medium such as novel to a multi-track medium like film brings in elements of music, sound effects, and moving image. But the film adds in a political context of racial tension between Japan and Korea, being the primary reason for conflict between Yoshihide and the Lord of Horikawa. However, cinema is not the only realm for media adaptation. Homer's The Odyssey is a tale that has received many adaptations, from television series to musical. Epic, the musical, in particular, being an audio-only adaptation of the epic poem, yet garnering enough popularity to gain full fan-created animatics. Odysseus' strife and peril at the hands of the deities of Olympus still managed to appeal to contemporary audiences. With the shift in medium, the genre may change as well, which creates a shift in the expectations of the audience. In an interview with Tegan Eagerly, the voice actress for Athena in Epic, she states that one of the appeals about the concept album is that it's relatively family-friendly, and whilst it is not 100% accurate to the myths, it's a great tool for learning and for getting people to engage with a story that otherwise they might not. The audience for a musical may be drastically unlike those who will read the poem, due to a shift in tone and delivery, yet Epic invites them to enjoy the Odyssey in a way that appeals more to their sensibilities. And this is the idea at the core of my piece. The adaptations of literature into a different medium invites a new audience to absorb the key concepts and themes in a way that may resonate with them better. Films and musicals are examples of a very linear way to consume media. What I mean by this isn't in relation to stories, but rather the control the audience has over the passage of time. The audience is a passive observer to the story, rather than an active inhabitant of the world. But why does the intake of a story matter? Well, that's where I'm going to cover. Film has a tendency towards linearity and regularity, whereas games have a tendency towards contingency, randomization, and an increased demand on their players to move the plot along. In a medium like film, there's a set runtime. Within it, they deliver a narrative regardless of the spectators. There's no influence a viewer can have within the story, and the show will simply go on. Within the environment of a game, a player is responsible for the entire world itself. The audience is changed from a passive observer to an active participant within that heterocosm. A game will not progress without input from the player, meaning that perception of time is heavily altered. We experience time as passing in a film, but we also control time in game parts, making for an intriguing hybrid temporal dimension. Hollow Knight is an action-adventure Metroidvania, in which you play as the Knight, a bug venturing through the ruined kingdom of Hallownest, in which residents are under the control of a hive mind named the Radiance. The game contains multiple endings, all of which allow the player to combat the Radiance and free the denizens of Hallownest. However, if the player stays in King's Pass, the starting area of the game, simply staring at the desolate cliffs, the bugs that roam the Forgotten Kingdom continue to suffer under the dominion of the Radiance. So, by playing as the Knight, by venturing through this world, by talking to the creatures inhabiting this land, by being hit by a primal aspid, for God's sake, and by killing the Radiance, you enter the narrative and visual world, and are able to enact in its logic both physically and cognitively. One of the ways Hollow Knight immerses the player is through the way it uses mapping. Jesper Jules defines mapping as the relationship between playtime and event time, when a player selects an input and the time it takes for it to be reflected within the game. Action games tend to have one-to-one mapping, meaning that when the player presses a button, the Knight immediately swings the nail, the typical gameplay loop of action games being to deal damage at the right time and avoid attacks from enemies in order to stay alive. Using the player's reaction time to induce a pseudo fight or flight response helps to engross the player. However, as is with any category of media, games exist in a multitude of genres. Turn-based games, for example, market themselves towards a different audience. Instead of using one-to-one mapping, the method of gameplay alternates between a player and enemy turn, with games in the genre focusing on strategy and tactics, in which thinking and planning is emphasized over reaction speed and dexterity. Fate Grand Order is a turn-based gacha game in which you play as a self-insert protagonist and control servants, generally figures from history and mythology whose legends have been conceptualized into magical abilities, and they fight in order to take back humanity. The fact it's a gacha game, a style of game where you spend in-game currency for a chance to roll certain characters, contributes to the playstyle of the game. The player has access to a wide variety of characters to choose from, which leads to decisions in team composition and servant compatibility when facing enemy units. The guise of legendary figures as playable characters creates an appeal to players already familiar with the figure's story, and invites them to discover how the Fate franchise chooses to tell the story and reflect it through gameplay. Alternatively, it gives uninformed players a chance to discover their tale. Now, with an introduction to game genres defined, it's finally time I start talking about Project Moon. Lobotomy Corporation, Library of Ruina, and Limbus Company all take place within the city. Lobotomy Corporation is a roguelike monster management simulation game taking place in the titular Lobotomy Corporation, in which you manage abnormalities, abnormal entities which are used to generate power. Library of Ruina is a turn-based deck-building RPG that takes place after the events of Lobotomy Corp, in which you follow deuteragonists Angela and Roland, as Angela plans to take revenge on the city for her suffering in Lobotomy Corp. Limbus Company is a turn-based gacha game which follows amnesiac manager Dante as they lead their 12 sinners bearing the names of literature protagonists through the world of the city, with their guide named Virgilius, in reference to the Divine Comedy. I will be predominantly focusing on Limbus Company, as it contains the most relevance to the adaptation of classical literature, as each main story chapter, dubbed a canto, again in reference to the Divine Comedy, focuses on a sinner, and reflects the plot of the novel of origin, albeit somewhat loosely, as it is incorporated into the world of the city. For example, in the case of Ishmael from Moby Dick, she is taken from after the novel concludes. Ishmael is left floating on Queequeg's coffin after the whale destroys the Pequod, and her story chapter operates as a pseudo-sequel to the events of Moby Dick. The stories not only undergo a medium shift, but a genre shift as well. In the case of Wuthering Heights, the setting of the Yorkshire Moors is cast aside in favour of Teacorp, a monochrome area of the city in which the concept of colour is one only afforded to those with affluence, quite literally, as the hues and tones are drained from the core cast upon entry into the district. It may seem like quite a far departure from the place and time, and yet still manages to reflect the key points of Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff and Catherine's miscommunications lead them into a cycle of obsession and tragedy, which serves to wound them both. There are differences within the game story. For example, the appearance of Isabella Linton. She's quite a prominent character within the novel. However, in-game she dies prior to Heathcliff's arrival back to the manor. Incorporating novels with vastly different settings means that everything does not translate over entirely. It's an act of salvaging, interpreting, and then creating something new, in order to build a cohesive world. Each story chapter usually takes place within a separate district of the city, helping to isolate the events of each individual sinner's narrative, as well as weaving them into the already existing lore, previously set up by the past installments. Gregor Samsa, in reference to the Metamorphosis protagonist, gains insect-like features not as a result of the effect society has on him, but rather the product of genetic experimentation developed during the Smoke War, a war which Lobotomy Corporation was instrumental in orchestrating. Yet, his social ostracization is caused by the insect appendages, in contrast to the novel, where others' viewpoints cause his transformation. The outline of literature narratives is not exclusive to Limbus Company, however. It's also present in Library of Ruin. As I previously mentioned, one of the protagonists is named Roland, in reference to the protagonist of Orlando Furioso, A Tale of Orlando, or, as he is called in English, Roland, and his rage towards discovering his wife Angelica's infidelity. However, in the world of the city, the source of his fury is towards Angelica's death. More aptly, the reason behind Angelica's death, which is revealed to be Angela as the narrative progresses. The passion for the incorporation of literature stems from Project Moon's CEO, Kim Ji-hoon, being immersed in literature from his childhood and wanting to escape in fiction and then going on to incorporate it in his games. Fans of Project Moon's output go on to share a similar enthusiasm for the source literature. A Reddit poll conducted on r/Limbus Company showed that out of 872 players, 493 wanted to purchase and read the source novels, with 276 responders claiming they may consider. Users on X.com even go as far as to provide breakdowns of the books of origin, in this case, Hellscream, in order to theorize about upcoming events and highlight lore-relevant details prior to the release of the new story chapter. There's a clear level of engagement and interest from the fans for the stories of origin. The creation of the games and the community that inhabits them brings a whole new audience to the literature, in an age where books continue to be read less. Some of the appeal to this is brought about by the inclusion of an oral world. In an interview with Jung Sain, the voice acting director for Studio EIM, composers for Project Moon soundtracks, he said,
예를 들면 손수호 성우께서 연기한 룰랑은 젠틀하면서도 속을 숨기는 이중적인 면을 살리기 위해서 평소보다 마이크를 가깝게 세팅해서 녹음받는 식으로 개성을 살렸고, 그 결과 게임 안에서 딥하면서도 매력적인 음색으로 잘 표현된 것 같아서 개인적으로 만족스럽습니다.
The titular Furioso is present within the game's soundtrack too, with audio director Lee Yong-gwang stating,
다들 아시겠지만 그냥 겉으로 볼 때는 약간 평범하면서도 건들건들한 그런 일반적인 캐릭터인데, 뒤로 갈수록 슬픔과 분노와 같은 감정들이 좀 강렬하게 표현되는 캐릭터였어요. 이런 복합적인 감정들을 느끼다 보니 작업하면서도 그 마음속에 좀 동요가 크고 강렬해서 저희도 작업하면서 창작의 고통을 좀 다른 곡들보다 많이 느끼면서 작업했던 것 같습니다. 그래서 이렇게 창작의 고통이 컸던 만큼 더 애정이 많이 가는 곡으로 남은 것 같습니다.
but these are elements which can be found in other forms of multimedia. What makes this so compelling is the fact that music exists through time, and time in games is organized by narrative events facilitated by play. Now, I can't talk about the music of Project Moon games without mentioning the artist Millie. Millie is a Japanese indie band who are very synonymous with Project Moon games. They're responsible for creating songs which play within the games. In Library of Ruina and Limbus Company, they mainly work to encapsulate the emotional journey of the characters and the destination they have arrived at. I was fortunate enough to attend the 1 Million Moons concert. A concert solely consisting of songs from Project Moon games, and the turnout was incredible. When playing In Hell We Live Lament, the opening theme for Limbus Company, the stage was backlit to resemble Mephistopheles, the titular Limbus, showing off this element of paratextuality to further strengthen the connection between the game and artist. MIDI songs are very significant within Project Moon games due to the revealing of the lyrics through gameplay. When a combat encounter features a song by Millie, it initially reveals a few lines of the song, with instrumental looping a certain section. The music traps your perception in this temporal bubble until you've progressed through play. And then, once you unlock that new section, you're rewarded with new lyrics. And it's this change in the state of gameplay, this change in the state of the music, that works together to create this ludo-narrative consonance, where gameplay and narrative work in harmony because of the music. In the 8th canto, when Honglu opens the gate and drowns his family elders who used him to serve as their amusement his whole life, it's accompanied by the chorus swelling as it narrates the culmination of Honglu's feelings and the beauty a finite lifespan holds in comparison to immortality. It pulls the player into this moment. Despite Limbus being a turn-based game, it's the music that creates this intensity between self and game, character and world. And it's not purely the music that works to engage you either, it's the use of alternate mechanics. When Sancho fights against the disillusioned Don Quixote, the player is prompted with a quick-time event, temporarily changing genres as the boundary between cutscene and gameplay becomes blurred, using mapping to force the player to gallop on together with Sancho and continue on the impossible dream. When you're forced to fight against Heathcliff and Catherine, who have roped themselves into an endless cycle of tragedy, enduring wave after wave, you're taken to the menu screen. Games are quick to solidify our expectations of them, which means it's very easy to overlook possible interactions that could occur within their functions. Which is why, when you're directed to the starting screen and see the button Clear All Cathy, a button that has never existed before, in a space that held no gameplay benefit whatsoever, and the gameplay fuses with the user interface as you delete Catherine from existence, watching as the bar for downloading game data builds up to erase her entirety. You're left in awe. This is my favourite moment in Limbus Company. It's why I wanted to write this. There are many adaptations of these stories into several forms, because we need the same stories over and over as one of the most powerful, perhaps the most powerful of ways to assert the basic ideology of our culture. Throughout history, ideas have travelled from person to person and from one period to another. Interpretations of works are vastly different depending on time and culture, with Kim Ji-hoon stating, "My Korean mindset and way of thinking may be reflected in my works, even if I'm not aware of it." I'm a British man making an essay on a South Korean game company who has adapted work from a Russian author in the 19th century. Project Moon has taken over my life for the past 3 years, and its stories heavily influenced my creative output. Honestly, before playing Limbus Company, I didn't have a vested interest in literature, like Crime and Punishment or Moby Dick. And now I'm reading the Odyssey, wondering how on earth the figure of Poseidon could possibly fit into the futuristic hellscape of the city. I am living proof of the fact that these games do create new audiences to return to the novel of origin. Project Moon uses these works of fiction as a starting point and incorporates them into this sprawling world. Despite being a horrific dystopia, there's this sense of a light at the end of the tunnel. The reason Dante's head is a clock is because at some point the sinner's times were frozen, and in following Dante, they moved again. We see that life in the city continues to persevere. The aim of literature is to be used as a vessel to tell stories about the intrinsic nature of humanity, and I think by presenting the city as a hyper-oppressive landscape, it allows the compassion of humanity to shine even brighter as it fights against it. The appeal of Project Moon works is undeniably in their stories. They are tragic, yet leave you with a feeling of hope in some way.